All right, we back. We never left. We never left. I was just scrolling through Kasparov's legacy Twitter account. He's mostly on Blue Sky now. Here he was attacking Elon Musk for attacking Ned, the National Network for Democracy. Interesting from someone with no foreign policy experience beyond bashing Ukraine and endorsing fascists. Didn't you have fascists as part of your United Against Putin? Isn't that why liberal groups disavowed you? If this hit list had been written by Putin, would it be any different? If this tweet had been written by the CIA, would it be any different, Gary? Also, someone with no foreign policy interest. Where was yours from? Where's yours for the first 37 years of your life? Let's get back to the good stuff. So, we're in 2022. He and former oil tycoon Mikhail Khodorkovsky co-founded the Anti-War Committee of Russia, a platform for exiled Russian figures to coordinate efforts against Putin's war. They also wanted to give voice to Russians who reject the war. The Anti-War Committee appealed to Western governments as well. So again, they did two things. Hold Putin accountable for war crimes in the war, dovetailing with the Biden State Department's efforts to isolate Russia internationally, and sanctions and accountability. In effect, Kasparov and colleagues became crucial interlocutors for conveying the stance of real Russians. Interlocutor, you know what that means? Intermediary, a go-between, a back channel, a shadow diplomat, an invaluable narrative for U.S. diplomacy. Now, the Anti-War Committee is very interesting because it also tried to foment an anti-war movement within Russia while fomenting a pro-war movement within the U.S. You guys may have heard me talk about this before. Shout out to longtime subs who have heard me talk about the U.S. Army War College's sort of consensus framework for understanding the four theaters of war, the four quadrants of war: the strategic, the tactical, the logistical, and the political. Four ways to win or lose a war: good or bad strategy, good or bad tactics, good or bad logistics, or good or bad politics. Now, the politics side of it is all about maximizing support for the war on your side and minimizing support for the war on the other side. This is why anti-Vietnam War protesters were called Russian communists. And the CIA and FBI and NSA and IRS went after them in the 1960s and 70s because they said, you're undermining our war effort. At the same time, they were fomenting anti-war elements in other countries, peaceniks in other countries, in order to loosen the country's morale about the war, to highlight their own family members coming back in body bags from the war, and crucially, to lobby their parliaments and governments to stop funding the war because the anti-war movement is so big that the elected representatives have to be accountable to them. So this is not anti-war at all. This group will be urging more and more military funding for the war from the U.S. side, but trying to speak to Russians to tell the Russian parliament to authorize less funds for war in Ukraine. Do you understand that? Every word is a lie. This is not anti-war. This is pro-war. Same thing when they say, the Knight Foundation for the First Amendment, and they're the ones who are funding all the censorship labs. They don't give a flying fuck about the First Amendment. They want to kill the First Amendment. They mean First Amendment rights for us and nobody else. This means anti-war for Russia, maximum war from NATO. Okay? Now, crucially, he co-founds that with a figure whose history we all live in the shadow of. MBK, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. We're going to get more on this figure, You may remember him from such movies as Russiagate, Burisma, the Biden foreign policy on Ukraine, the Clinton Global Initiative. You may remember this man from all sorts of wacky direct and indirect appearances in most of U.S. foreign policy towards Eurasia, arguably all of U.S. foreign policy towards Eurasia over the past 10 years. We're going to get more on that as we go. But crucially, this is the co-founder with Garry Kasparov for the movement to kill support for the war inside of Russia and maximize support for the war inside the U.S. Appealing to Western governments. We went over this whole thing. Kasparov's high profile in the West made him a target of the Kremlin. The regime went further, declaring him a terrorist and extremist in absentia. He's listed as a foreign agent. The absurdity of branding a peaceful democracy advocate as a terrorist was noted by human rights groups. Peaceful. Largely peaceful. The escalation by Moscow underscores how threatening Kasparov's work, much of it done in partnership with international NGOs and Western agencies, like the Central Intelligence Agency, seen by Putin. He serves today as a kind of government in exile figurehead, relentlessly calling to break up Russia, overthrow Russia's government. He continues to chair or advise multiple organizations, the Human Rights Foundation, the Renew Democracy Initiative. He's on the board of the Free Russia Foundation, as we talked about. Vice President of the World Liberty Congress. He's a busy man. Frequent speaker at forums like the Summit for Democracy, which is like the Summit for CIA. And he's a frequent speaker at think tanks like the Atlantic Council, NATO's think tank with 7 CIA directors and annual funding from the Pentagon and State Department. The Aspen Institute, the Hudson Institute for Free Markets. Meaning just taking all of the assets and industries in Russia for Chamber of Commerce companies, U.S. Chamber of Commerce companies. In all these venues, he amplifies U.S. objectives, advocating for sustained sanctions, military support to Ukraine. Oh, hey, I thought we were the anti-war committee. There's something in my eye. The anti-war committee demands more military funding, more payments to Raytheon and military contractors. Defeating Putin in Ukraine is the fastest path to liberating Russia. And robust backing of Russian civil society, meaning U.S. aid, which is why I came out so hard against cuts to U.S. aid or NED. His public statements often align so closely with U.S. policy that it sometimes appears he is an unofficial envoy. For example, Kasparov lauded Biden's description of Putin as a killer and urged even stronger rhetoric. Remember, this is the guy, Kasparov insists that Trump was likely recruited by the KGB in 1987, 4 years before the Cold War even ended. He advances U.S. State Department goals both explicitly and implicitly. Explicitly by partnering with U.S.-funded platforms. We have the sort of flow chart here. Vocal presence on CNN and Fox. And of course, he encourages U.S. support for the Belarus protests. That was our attempted color revolution in Belarus while I was at the State Department. That was a very eye-opening period for me when I was at the State Department in summer 2020. Getting peripheral traffic on how well our little attempt to overthrow the democratically elected government of Belarus was. That was quite a period for me, getting that inbound. Of course. Okay. We're going to get to even crazier stuff in a minute here. Let me just see what else, if I missed anything. Kasparov's public statements and campaigns often presaged or reinforced U.S. policy shifts. Under President George W. Bush, as the administration grew disillusioned with Putin's course, Kasparov's emergence gave tangible form to the State Department's democratic agenda in Russia. Just when Putin started slipping out of the grasp of the Bush State Department, like magic, a popular world hero of the Russian people, the greatest chess player ever did play, suddenly appears as a opposition candidate doing everything the U.S. State Department wants. He was a living rebuke to Putin and a natural partner for U.S. democracy advocates. Kasparov was initially gadfly, criticizing the Russian reset as naive, because remember, while Hillary Clinton was striking deals with Russia and Uranium One, they thought, because at the time the Democrats liked Russia, but the Republicans were pissed off about Georgia and other things because their oil deals were getting fucked up. But then Ukraine unified in 2014 when the coup failed. During President Trump's tenure, Kasparov's role was almost that of an alternate envoy. A shadow diplomat, as we'll see, funded under Trump's nose by his own USAID and Ned. This is why it's so important to knock this out and finish the job here. Hold a sec. Key figure in U.S. democracy promotion networks, as we mentioned, Human Rights Foundation, Renewed Democracy Initiative, Free Russia Foundation, Cato, Atlantic Council, McCain Institute, National Endowment for Democracy, USAID programs. The dude is a fucking Forrest Gump of CIA world. Civil society empowerment. Okay, so we got sources here. Okay, so then I asked, from 2003 to present, how many civil society groups, NGOs, political parties, or groups did Garry Kasparov work with, speak to, or belong to that received U.S. government funding directly or indirectly? How much U.S. government funding did each group get? Okay. Payroll, baby. Hold on a sec. Oh. Sorry, I'm trying to do this. Okay. So here you go. So his Human Rights Foundation, that he was the chairman of, partnered with USAID. Now it says it's primarily privately funded, but that's probably because when he started it, before USAID was kicked out of the country, but when USAID was well, I guess they were kicked out in 2012. So I'll see what date did he actually start the Human Rights Foundation? Because it's USAID partnered, but USAID probably had intermediaries do the funding. So it's indirect because they say, so he starts this Human Rights Foundation in 2012. U.S. government funding, it says indirect via U.S.-based private donations, but they partnered with USAID in events. It says it's primarily privately funded, but I would bet that means it's privately funded by NGOs who are funded by USAID. Because at the time, in 2012, USAID was, I think, kicked out in October 2012. And they must have known they were on the skids that Russian counterintelligence would be all over direct USAID funding. So let's see. Human Rights Foundation. Wait, it says he was named chairman in 2011. Wait, hold on a second. Is this the same one? Hold on. Human Rights Foundation. Yeah, chairman. Okay, so 2011. Founded in 2005. The very year that Kasparov decides to quit chess and become a champion of CIA regime change in Russia. Political repression, pro-democracy advocacy. Well, here it says served as chairman from 2012 to 2024. So it's either 2012 or 2011. Art in protest. Okay, here you go. National Endowment for Democracy. Yeah, it gets $400 million a year now. Renew Democracy Initiative. Also, partnerships with USAID think tanks. Again, so it works with USAID, works with. And again, the private funding could just mean USAID gives money to an entity, and that entity gives to Renew Democracy Initiative. So it's USAID funded, but because you can't get transparency on USAID's books because it's more tightly guarded than the fucking CIA, you never know if private funding means CIA proprietary by way of USAID. This is how they ran Zunzaneo. This is how they ran Save the Children, etc. Now, the Free Russia Foundation that Garry Kasparov, what was his involvement with that Free Russia Foundation? It says advisor, contributor, speaker. I thought he played a pretty active role in that. Let's see, FRF. He co-founded the Free Russia Forum. So he co-founded it. So he co-founds it. That itself works with the National Endowment for Democracy and EU counterparts to fund FRF. So it's funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. It's directly funded by the fucking CIA. The group, the founder of the National Endowment for Democracy said the CIA got in trouble when it gave funding to groups because it would scandalize those groups when they got funding, when it came out they got funding from the CIA. That's why we fund them. And that's who's funding Garry Kasparov's Free Russia Forum that he started. EU counterparts are going to mean things like the European Endowment for Democracy, which is the transatlantic side of NATO's NED equivalent. $5 million? They've gotten $5 million from the National Endowment for Democracy? Let's see, Free Russia Foundation NED grants. You can't even get this shit anymore because they friggin' purged, NED's grants 2023 to present are all under a blanket secrecy. They blanked everything, but we might be able to go back in the Wayback Machine. 10 years of work since 2014. Offices in Brussels and Washington, NATO headquarters and DC headquarters. Media campaigns, media engagement, legislative engagement to lobby Congress. Public policies, sanctions database. Non-public activities, covert action. So this is Garry Kasparov's joint that he co-founds. They've got public overt activity, media, lobbying Congress, advising on public policy, the executive branch, maintaining a sanctions database, but then also covert action, non-public activities, private meetings, back channels, social and political processes. Where are your assets on the ground? Russian economy and sanctions brief. Community support. Pro-democracy and anti-war projects. Anti-war over there. The biggest war hawks in the world over here. Strategic Communications Center. Counter-propaganda projects. What are they? Is this free speech group in Russia because Stratcom is the big censorship phrase. Basically anything that you as an American citizen say that is anti-war is going to be framed as Putin propaganda. They'll probably argue to try to censor it. 100 plus exiled Russian experts. We reached 20 million people. Monitoring analysis of political and social events nationwide, regionally. Propaganda campaigns, ecosystems, narratives. Coordinates efforts of 20 exiled Russian organizations. Elf Legion. Well, there it fucking is. This is gonna be the Lithuanian elves. Aren't they? Didn't they start in Lithuania? Lithuanian elves is the fucking NATO-funded, USAID-funded troll campaign that also like flags every anti-war tweet in the U.S. as disinformation, Russian disinformation. Join our Telegram. Oh yeah, you should see what he said about the Telegram founder. But I want to go back and see. Let's see what this looked like in the Wayback Machine. I wonder when they set this thing up. 2015. Let's see what it looked like then. Let's see what it looked like as a baby website. Nope, it's almost here. How about here? Nope, not yet. Let's go. How about here? I wonder if they have a donor page in their old one. We're gonna mine it. Okay. 2015. We are committed to Russians consolidating our efforts to rebuild freedom and democracy in Russia. Let's see. About civil society program in Russia. Vision of Russia. No war. Of course, if you hold that sign up in the U.S., they'll shoot you. Yeah, freedom of speech, except in the U.S. This is so funny. See how fucking deep these ops go? Partners, Committee for Russian Economic Freedom. I bet you all of these are Ned funded. Does not have a direct to see about. Russia after Putin, without Putinism. This is what they say about Trump. After Trumpism. Team experts. Partners. Wait, movements. Is that movements.org? Congress Community of American Ukrainians. Dude, I bet it's all subfunded through that. Let's see if it gets. Let's just check a year later and see what it looks like. I want to know what the justification for that 5.5 million figure is, because ChatGPT says that they got $5.5 million from the U.S. government, and I want to know. I want to know. Okay. Committee for Russian Economic Freedom. Economic Freedom. You're going to see how funny that is when we get into the deep stuff here. Committee. Let's just try this one. Committee for Russian Economic Freedom. USA, NED. Let's just try like some shit like that. About. See, they're not going to disclose it because it'll put them in the Russian crosshairs. Because Ned got kicked out in 2015 in Russia. Or 2016. Started in 2009. The U.S.-Russia Business Council. We're back to the Chamber of Commerce. And here it is, the Yukos case. There it is. Holy shit. You're going to see. The Yukos thing is what started this whole fucking thing. I can't wait to show you guys that. Oh my God. Largest Russian oil company. Oh my God, it's that fucking direct? That's who fucking paid for. That's insane. New York Bar Association. Board of Directors in the American Chamber of Commerce in Moscow for 6 years. Wow. Legal counsel for Yukos. And its former CEO, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Holy shit. You guys are going to see why that's so insane in a bit here. Oh, but I want to, I'm going to leave this tab open because I want to come back to that. One sec. Okay. Okay, wait. Committee for Russian Economic Freedom. I could look this up in usaspending.gov, but I just, here you go. National Endowment for Democracy Committee, of course. It's so predictable. It's so friggin' predictable. Stifling the public sphere. Media. So, of course, these are the same people who argue to censor media and civil society organizations like mine in America. They want free speech for them. Let's see. Committee. What was it? What was that called again? Committee. Russian Economic Freedom. Yeah. You're going to. Yeah, Russian Economic Freedom. Yeah. Ned Partner Soup. All right. Oh, here you go. USAID, Ned, State Department. I'll find the link for that later. Let's just assume for now that this is okay. $5 million from USAID, NED, State Department. The Helsinki Commission, U.S. government funded. Atlantic Council, Freedom House, Hudson Institute, McCain. Atlantic Council, $30 million from the U.S. government. Freedom House, $25 million to $35 million. McCain Institute, which is USAID funded. Institute of Modern Russia, funded from Khodorkovsky. World Liberty Congress, it says, likely receives support from NED USAID via the Human Rights Foundation, but the funding is not public. So the whole thing is juiced with tens of millions of USAID funds. All these places that he's coordinating at, and then $5.5 million to the one that he co-founded. A lot of money for a chess player. So, let me now turn to this Khodorkovsky issue. Okay. So I was listening to Kasparov at around the 20-minute mark. He talks about how he got into this business. Because remember, those searches, I initially started with him in 2004, 2005, because he quit chess in 2005. So I figured in 2004, he was up to some stuff. I don't want to make it too unwieldy. But then I heard him say this.
Playing the game and Putin
retaliate, come after them and destroy them. And again, I'm not.
So this is all about what he's saying is what Charlie Sykes is saying here is business leaders are afraid of Donald Trump. That's why Elon and Bezos and everyone is sucking up to him, just like Putin, the oligarchs sucked up to him. Because Trump will weaponize the Justice Department against his political enemies. Like literally he says that. It's so, I won't even play the blood boiling unless it continues from here, because it might be like a minute earlier. But he's like, Trump will weaponize the Justice Department then and could even put them under arrest. That's why the business community is allowing Trump to do what he's doing. Like, bitch, you weaponize the Justice Department directly against Trump. You hit him with 1,000 years of prison time. 91 felony counts, you son of a bitch. But let's just keep playing this.
Not so naive as to think that this was never abused in the past. We had Richard Nixon, but it all seems.
He said, it's just the Justice Department was abused in the past, like Richard Nixon. Bitch, a fucking year ago, you did it to Trump. Oh, but that would make you the fucking dictator the CIA needs to overthrow. So can't say that.
It was really pale in comparison to what we have now, coming back to the Putinization of America, all power concentrated in one person, surrounded by sycophants, with much of society, civil society, terrified, afraid to take him on.
Again, this is 1 month ago, this thing. Listen to what Kasparov says here.
Putin had great intuition, when and how to strike. In 2003, he made a very important decision. By that time, we already destroyed independent television, so he already had, the Second Chechen War, so he was already concentrating power. But
2003. This is 3 years into Putin's term. Now, I had been aware of this Khodorkovsky affair, this MBK Mikhail Khodorkovsky affair, but I'd mostly focused on the State Department's evolving position vis-a-vis Putin, because the State Department backed Putin at first. He was the hand-picked successor from Boris Yeltsin, the complete and total CIA puppet. I had mostly focused on the 2005 period forward for the past year or so, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, on the gas diplomacy element and the oil and gas aspects of this. Mostly in terms of how the State Department reacted with Russia's affairs in Ukraine in 2005, the gas diplomacy, threatening to cut off the gas there, threatening to cut off the gas in Georgia, all over Central Europe. They called Gazprom an instrument of statecraft. But this 2003 event is fascinating. And you'll notice that Kasparov calls Putin's arrest of Khodorkovsky like the pivotal moment in the change in U.S. statecraft. Well, he doesn't put it that way, but we'll see that's what it is.
then he went after the richest man in Russia, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the largest.
The richest man in Russia, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Let me play this again. I'm just going to let it ride, and then we're just going to listen.
Had, the Second Chechen War, so he was already concentrating power. But then he went after the richest man in Russia, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the largest oil company. It was a big gamble. If other oligarchs would...
So he arrested the richest man in Russia in 2003, Putin did. The biggest oligarch, who was the head of the biggest oil company in Russia, which has the most oil reserves in the world.
Would support Khodorkovsky, Putin could be overthrown.
So what he says is, Khodorkovsky was a Russian oligarch who was arrested by Putin, but if the other oligarchs had banded together, Putin could have been overthrown. For some reason, the other oligarchs backed Putin and allowed MBK to be jailed. He's saying, but the solution is not like the oligarchy is bad. The solution is the other oligarchs should have worked together to topple Putin.
But he could smell that this is the right moment, because all others wanted is to make a deal. I mean, they didn't want to have an open accounting system like Khodorkovsky. They didn't want to merge with the free world companies. That like Khodorkovsky planned, merger of Yukos with Exxon on Chevron.
You catch that? Let me... DJ, play that back. Type in the chat if you're with me. I know it's almost 4 a.m. here. Why are we stopping the tape? Did you hear what he just said? This Russian oligarch in charge of the largest Russian oil company in the largest oil producing country in the world, Russia, was singled out by Putin and arrested, and none of the other oligarchs opposed it, even though if they had banded together, they could have overthrown Putin. But the one that was arrested by Putin was trying to... I'm sorry, say it again?
He wanted to merge with the free world.
He wanted to merge with the free world...
companies, that like Khodorkovsky planned.
Companies. Khodorkovsky planned...
merger of Yukos with Exxon on Chevron.
A merger of Yukos with the largest oil company in all of Russia with Exxon and Chevron. Oh. So the guy who was arrested, who was running the largest oil company in all of Russia, was planning to make Exxon and Chevron the beneficiaries of Russian oil rather than the Russian people. And Putin wanted the people of Russia to profit from Russian oil rather than Exxon and Chevron, the famous private face of most CIA and State Department statecraft for 100 years. The number one and number two largest oil companies in America wanted that Russian oil, and those Russian oligarchs who had been allied with the U.S. State Department and CIA and NED as they were undergoing shock therapy privatization during the Yeltsin years. Russia, that oligarch, was working with American companies to have Americans get the oil. And so, because of Russian nationalism and Putin wanting Russians to profit from Russian oil rather than American firms, that's what kicked off the animosity between the State Department and Putin in 2003. The whole point of Russia is the oil and gas. The whole point is the petroleum. That's where most of the $75 trillion in natural resources that Russia holds comes from. We're going to get much deeper into this in a second, but this is an important point because MBK, that Russian oligarch, is the guy who's bankrolling Kasparov's operations. He's the one who spawns this guy's career, as we saw in the chart. Directly with this March 2022 organization, but then indirectly because of directly, but through pass-throughs with the MBK funded groups that kickstarted his other organizations. But that was because MBK wanted to partner with State Department battering ram companies like Exxon and Chevron. And Putin wanted to keep the oil for Russians after the United States wrecked the Russian economy in the 1990s with privatization. Much more on that.
They wanted to do this as the, a background deal with the state. So to negotiate, and not to pay taxes, but to be part of this,
Sure.
Kind of semi-criminal, quasi-criminal system. So Trump also has this instinct. So I think it's animal instinct. He smells like the predators. They smell blood. Trump smells weakness.
So this is motivated. This whole thing is motivated by the fact that we took over Russia in the 1990s. Jeffrey Sachs took over Russia at the USAID-funded Harvard Institute for International Development. George Soros took over Russia in the 1990s with the Quantum Fund, Casino Moscow. We took everything, sold it off to Wall Street in London. But the crown jewel, biggest oil company, Yukos, was on the verge of being sold off to the West. We would finally get the oil, the crown jewel of Russia. And as we'll see, on the eve of that deal being inked, Putin arrested the head of that Russian oil company and then proceeded to nationalize the oil, thwarting the great plans of the Central Intelligence Agency in Russia in the 1990s. So as soon as I heard this, I said, okay. Here's what I want. I want a profile of all of Khodorkovsky's. I'm just going to say MBK. So it goes away. Support by the U.S. State Department, directly or indirectly, or by U.S. government-funded NGOs. What was Khodorkovsky's relationship with American diplomats and business leaders and NGOs before his arrest in 2003? The case of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the richest man in Russia, worth $15 billion in 2003. I think he was the number 18 richest person in the entire world. And head of Yukos, the biggest oil company in Russia at the time. Intersects with U.S. foreign policy and civil society networks in several nuanced ways. Prior to his arrest in October 2003, Khodorkovsky had complex but observable interactions with U.S. diplomats, the State Department, NGOs, political actors. Though direct U.S. government support to him personally is not documented, but you'll see. Watch this. Okay. Relationship with the U.S. government and diplomats, pre-2003. Diplomatic engagement. Declassified U.S. embassy cables in 2002 and 2003 before his arrest show regular contact between Khodorkovsky and senior U.S. diplomats in Moscow. So he's talking directly with the embassy. So the U.S. embassy, this is the Jeffrey Sachs quote, the only reason the United States is the only country in the world that has never been overthrown from within in a coup is because the U.S. is the only country in the world that doesn't have a U.S. embassy. Because the State Department's boots on the ground in the embassy is who always works to organize the coup with the locals, the local leaders, business leaders, union leaders, academic leaders, religious leaders, political leaders. He met with Ambassador Alexander Vershbow and other political officers to discuss Russian politics, economic reform, and Putin's consolidation of power. Khodorkovsky expressed concern about authoritarian trends, warned the U.S. about corruption in Russian state-owned firms, discussed the role of civil society, U.S. government-funded NGOs, as a counterbalance to Putin's power. He's working directly with senior U.S. diplomats about the need for U.S. State Department-funded NGOs to counterbalance the democratically elected president's power. One State Department cable noted Khodorkovsky was becoming increasingly political and could pose a challenge to the Kremlin's power structure. Business forums. Khodorkovsky had close ties prior to his arrest with U.S. and European corporate circles. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Attended the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he met with Western political and business leaders. Yukos was traded on U.S. markets via backdoor, audited by Arthur Andersen of Enron fame, signaling integration into Western financial systems. He hosted roundtables with American oil executives and policy thinkers supporting greater Western investment in Russian energy. Hold on a sec. So, this oligarch was the entry, and as we'll see, he was, before that, the Minister of Energy. He was the government guy in charge of the energy space. So he was undoubtedly working with those same diplomats and business leaders to privatize that as their man in the Russian government for all things oil and gas, to turn it over to Wall Street in London instead of Russia, their own country. We're going to get deeper into this in a sec. Civil society and NGO involvement pre-2003. In 2001, the richest man in Russia and the CEO and chairman of the biggest Russian oil company, again, Russia is mostly an oil state, so their whole economy rests on this. In 2001, 2 years beforehand, he starts the Open Russia Foundation, funded entirely by Khodorkovsky and Yukos, the biggest oil company in Russia. The foundation promoted civil society, rule of law, and independent media in Russia. I know if you've been subbed for more than a month or 2 months, you know CIA speak by now. Promoting civil society means promoting USAID-funded organizations' agenda. Rule of law means capturing the courts, the prosecutors, and the judges to stifle the elected president's agenda or to arrest the president and his allies. And independent media does not mean independent media. It means blob-favored media. While Open Russia was not U.S.-funded, it cooperated with and shared objectives with U.S. State Department-funded organizations, including Carnegie, Soros Open Society Networks, and Internews Russia. Internews. the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace is who Bill Burns, the CIA director under Biden, ran for 7 years from 2014 to 2021. Open Russia, open society. Again, he wanted to open up Russia, open up its butthole so that it could be economically exploited by American companies. What would Americans do if there was an open America that wanted, basically Russian oligarchs to take oil and gas in Houston? Through Open Russia, Khodorkovsky funded election monitoring, legal aid, and civic education. That means, mobilizing people, educate them about the need to take to the streets in mostly peaceful protests. And youth programs, youth mobilization, get the young people on the streets. These initiatives were ideologically aligned with U.S. civil society development goals, State Department, USAID-funded organization goals in Russia, and often overlapped with NED-funded Russian NGOs. Political activities that attracted U.S. attention. In 2002-2003, in the year before his arrest, the head of the biggest oil company in Russia began funding opposition political parties. You think the State Department was also backing them? We could take a detour and just look at these groups and see whether or not USAID was also funding their civic education and training programs, just running money, slushing into their networks. Oh, here we go. Both parties were frequent partners of U.S.-funded NGOs, such as NDI and IRI, the Democrat Party and Republican Party branches of the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA. So he's funding CIA-backed candidates while he's the richest man in Russia, in control of the biggest oil company in Russia. So when Putin arrested him, they went fucking apoplectic because he was the key to the complete, total domination of Russia and the end of Russian sovereignty. His political advocacy drew praise from Western diplomats and NGO observers. They fucking love this guy. U.S. officials were briefed on Khodorkovsky's growing political role and expressed concern to the Kremlin after his arrest. Post-arrest U.S. government reaction. State Department strongly criticized the arrest and the seizure of Yukos as politically motivated. Statements from the Bush administration members of Congress linked the arrest to his political and civil society activities, which were just supporting CIA-funded shit to topple Putin. Condoleezza Rice and Dick Cheney both cited. Dick Cheney, of course, was the fucking chairman and CEO of Halliburton, the major petro company who now has the oil refining rights in Ukraine, cited the case as emblematic of Putin's authoritarianism. The arrest led to a freeze in bilateral investment talks, a heightened scrutiny of Russia's judicial independence. Need more rule of law funding. Got to capture more of the judges. So we were on the verge of taking the Russian oil until Putin arrested the oil oligarch. Meetings with U.S. diplomats, NGOs he funded overlapped with U.S.-funded groups. So he funded Internews and Carnegie, U.S.-listed companies, supported opposition parties linked to U.S. NGOs. So what did I prompt next? Here's what I asked. What Western companies specifically, such as Exxon, Chevron, BP, and Shell? So I went Houston and London. What Houston-based oil companies and what London-based oil companies would have profited the most if Khodorkovsky had won the power struggle against Putin and achieved greater Western investment in Russian energy? You ready for this? If Khodorkovsky had won his power struggle with Putin in the early 2000s and succeeded in opening Russia's energy sector to greater Western investment, several major Western oil and gas companies stood to profit substantially, both through direct partnerships and access to vast untapped reserves. The most likely beneficiaries were ExxonMobil, the biggest oil company in the world, the biggest oil company in America. Pre-2003, pre-arrest status. ExxonMobil had already invested billions in Ukraine, including the Sakhalin-1 project, under a production sharing agreement with Rosneft, the state-owned. So again, Yukos was the biggest private-owned company. Rosneft was the national. This is just like Burisma was the largest or one of the largest private oil and gas companies, gas companies in Ukraine. And it was the feeder to Naftogaz, the state-owned one. This is what Yukos, the same relationship that Yukos had with Rosneft is the same relationship Burisma had with Naftogaz in Ukraine. Same thing. This is Burisma. This is like if Zelensky had like seized Burisma or something. Except way, way bigger, because Yukos was the biggest oil company in all of Russia. The biggest oil company. Now, get this. In 2002-2003, ExxonMobil was in advanced talks to purchase a major stake in Yukos up to 40%. So this oil, the biggest oil company in Russia, crown jewel of the entire Russian economy, Exxon was already in advanced talks to buy 40%. So when oil comes out of the ground in the massive Siberian oil fields, 40% of that does not go to Russians. It goes to the Houston American oligarchy. 40%. Exxon has been the battering ram of the CIA and State Department for 100 fucking years. Read Private Empire. Read Private Empire. ExxonMobil and American Power. We've gone over this before. Who was Trump's first Secretary of State, even though he never worked a day in government? You guys remember this guy before Mike Pompeo? He ran the entire fucking State Department, having never worked in government. The entire State Department, which oversees the CIA and USAID. What was he? What qualified him to be that? Because he was the chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil. You wonder why the fucking State Department helped the Russiagate coup against Trump? Why Trump had no control over his government? So the arrest of what looks to be a CIA asset, the guy directly funding all of the NED-funded groups, providing top-up funding to USAID and the State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy inside of Russia to fund opposition parties to oust Putin, to give more control to fucking Langley, Virginia. When he gets arrested and the deal falls through, had the deal succeeded, Exxon would have gained access to the Siberian oil fields, a stronghold in Russian pipeline development and export infrastructure. The impact. The Exxon-Yukos deal could have positioned Exxon as the dominant Western player in Russian oil, given Exxon access to some of the world's lowest cost reserves and allowed it to influence Eurasian energy politics. Remember, when Victoria Nuland gave the speech announcing USAID gave $5.4 billion to the groups around the Ukrainian riot squads who toppled Ukraine's government so that Victoria Nuland could install a new president. the 2014 Ukraine coup, two months before that, at the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation, Chamber of Commerce, she's in front of signs for ExxonMobil and Chevron. That's who's sponsoring her speech about USAID funding all the groups that just a month later would overthrow the Ukrainian government and set in motion the entire Ukraine-Russia war we now live in. Sponsored by Exxon and Chevron. So this is why I asked. Exxon, Chevron. Chevron, pre-2003. Chevron had interest in the Caspian and Black Sea regions, but was seeking a deeper entry into Russia. Yukos partnership. Chevron was reportedly the runner-up to Exxon in the Yukos stake sale negotiations. If Exxon balked at the deal to buy up all, an unbelievable proportion of Russia's oil, Chevron was next in line to get the deal. Yukos considered both companies as strategic investors in a merger or buyout. Chevron could have become a lead operator in Western Siberia. How about London? Because again, you have the whole London side of this. Christopher Steele, Richard Dearlove, the Anne Applebaum squad, the special relationship U.S.-UK Chamber of Commerce moves together on everything. Pre-2003. In 2003, British Petroleum was preparing a massive deal to form the TNK British Petroleum, a 50-50 joint venture with Russian oligarchs. Impact, if Khodorkovsky had succeeded, BP could have shifted its focus from TNK to partnership with Yukos Case. Greater westernization of the Russian oil would protect. Roda Shell. Shell was leading the Sakhalin 2 project, a large LNG venture in Russia's Far East. It became politically vulnerable after Khodorkovsky's fall, because you're going to see what happens to all these companies after this. The Khodorkovsky-led liberalization of Russian energy politics would have allowed Shell to retain greater control and export rights, expand access to Arctic and Siberian gas reserves. Shell's later loss of control over the Sakhalin project to Gazprom likely would not have occurred. So Putin nationalized, effectively, London's oil and gas interests, scooped up during the Yeltsin years when the CIA puppet sold off all these assets to London and Wall Street. Putin started seizing them back. That's how you got war on Russia. Nothing to do with democracy. Has to do with business. French companies as well. Strategic impact of a Yukos Western Oil Alliance. Khodorkovsky's #1 oil company. Richest man in Russia. What Khodorkovsky is planning. He's planning to merge Yukos with Sibneft to create the 4th largest oil company in the entire world. Invite Western investment and listing on the New York Stock Exchange, pushing Yukos into the Western financial system. Support privatization of pipelines. So basically undermining the nationally, the monopoly held by the Russian government-controlled Gazprom, so that those pipelines would be owned by Western companies. Enable Western-led Arctic exploration and possibly bypassing Gazprom's dominance in gas exports. At one point, Gazprom was, I think, the largest company in the world in the mid-aughts. All of European energy, not all of European gas was Gazprom. So who would have lost? If Khodorkovsky had won, who would be the big losers? If Putin was toppled and Khodorkovsky had won that power structure, that power struggle. Gazprom and Rosneft, Russia's state-owned gas company and Russia's state-owned oil company, would have been marginalized or forced to compete under less profitable rules. Putin's economic model will be weakened. Khodorkovsky's Russia would have been a strategic energy partner of the West rather than a challenge to it. We have gobbled it up rather than competed with it. And remember, this whole thing happened because we couldn't compete with Russia on price. That's why we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. That's why Exxon and Chevron and Shell and BP had major windfall profits with the war in Ukraine, because the State Department got their markets for them, because European companies were pressured by Washington to impose sanctions on cheap Russian gas, and they had to buy expensive Houston LNG. If Khodorkovsky had prevailed, Exxon and Chevron would have gained the most access to the world's largest untapped oil reserves outside of Saudi Arabia, direct partnerships, and infrastructure deals. BP and Shell would have gained access to gas fields, pipelines, and LNG terminals. The strategic landscape of global energy would have tilted significantly towards the U.S. and EU, reducing Kremlin's energy leverage across Europe. The strategic landscape of global energy would have tilted significantly towards the U.S. and EU if only the guy who was funding the CIA network of civil society organizations had defeated Putin in 2003. By the way, back to Milton Friedman. This is why I always say this clip. Let's see if I can find it on YouTube here.
14 is a lot for television, so I want to just go right down the list quickly and have you give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. Keep them or abolish them. Department of Agriculture.
Abolish.
Gone. Department of Commerce.
Abolish.
Gone. Department of Defense.
Keep.
Keep it.
Milton Friedman, keep the war. Keep the War Department. You're starting to see why this is Mr. Free Market, Mr. Law of perfect competition. Get rid of commerce, get rid of education, get rid of labor. Keep the War Department. You wonder why Garry Kasparov was getting Milton Friedman awards from the National Endowment for Democracy.
Department of Education.
Abolish.
Gone. Energy.
Abolish.
Housing.
Except that energy ties in with the military.
Well, then we shove it under defense.
That's
the little
right.
bit that handles the nuclear,
Right, that ought to go under
plutonium
defense.
and so forth goes under defense. But we.
So first he says to abolish the Department of Energy. DJ, play that back.
Department of Education.
Abolish.
Gone. Energy.
Abolish.
So first he says abolish. And then he goes, oh shit. But all of the oil companies who love my work and who I slosh through their whole network, we've been mutually reinforcing each other for 30 years. They need the Department of War to secure their markets. Exxon has no market if there's no U.S. military securing their oil fields and imposing its will on foreign countries so that ExxonMobil gets access to their oil reserves. So actually, I said abolish because I'm libertarian, but actually we do need that. But it's really a military thing, the Department of Energy. So tuck it under, keep it, but make it a sub-agency of our Department of War.
Except that energy ties in with the military.
Well, then.
Do you understand why Garry Kasparov and the Atlantic Council has 7 CIA directors and its biggest funder is the U.S. military? Okay. So then I ran searches here on Putin's weaponization of natural gas as an instrument of statecraft, 2004 forward. This is all things that I rattled off earlier about how once Putin pushed Chevron and Exxon and the U.S. State Department out of its own independent energy reserves, he began to use oil and gas as a lever to gain political influence across the Central and Eastern European countries that were the whole focus of the Cold War. So the State Department began to go, holy shit, there was an undeclared second Cold War that we're losing to Russia because of Putin's control over his own oil and gas. These are all the different leverage points. Because he retained sovereign control of it. just like we do here, except that we're selling them off to China. Hunter Biden was personally negotiating the sales of LNG ports in Louisiana to China. U.S. energy companies, ExxonMobil, negative impacts, blocked the Yukos acquisition. Granted, Masters, this is what we... Kremlin arrested Khodorkovsky, dismantled the Yukos deal just as the deal was nearing finalization. And then Gazprom absorbed Yukos instead of Exxon, Chevron, Shell, and BP, eliminating Exxon's opportunity. Okay? So instead of Exxon getting it, Rex Tillerson's company, the Russian people got it. The Russian state-owned one. So every dollar that Gazprom makes is another dollar in the Russian treasury instead of a dollar for Wall Street in London. By the way, I'm not even making a normative claim about whether this is good or bad. I want what's best for U.S. interests. But I won't be lied to. That this is about fucking democracy or some shit. This is about oil profits for the Houston boys. And financial profits for the New York hedge funds and London banks that invest in them. Exxon had ambitions in the Arctic shelf. Post-2006, Gazprom was declared the exclusive operator of all major Arctic gas projects. Exxon got completely boxed out. That's what it's about. They can't tell you that. Exxon was forced into a junior partnership role, losing bargaining power. Chevron, Putin's consolidation of Gazprom, effectively ended any chance of equity partnerships in Russia's gas sector. Understand, that's why we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, guys, because of Gazprom. How many hundreds of hours of video have I put out on Gazprom? There's a great 20-minute video. I'll link it in chat right now. I'm going to put a bunch of these on screen. Here you go. Put this for you guys here. The secret history of the U.S.-Russia energy war. The Grand Ukraine Energy Play. This is what I refer to as the Grand Ukraine Energy Play, which invest in private Ukraine gas companies, privatize Ukraine's publicly held gas giant, Naftogaz, kill Gazprom, kill Nord Stream. NATO's energy companies become the new suppliers, dominate the market. Watch this for history on Gazprom. And then add this into your knowledge set, what we just covered. Oh, shoot. Sorry. I have to put it as a... Note, Putin and Soros locked in fight for control of Ukraine's gas transit company. For more than 10 years, Vladimir Putin and George Soros have sought to acquire Ukraine's state-owned gas transit company. George Soros led that fight. Shortly after being elected, Zelensky allowed for Soros' plan rather than Putin's to be implemented in Ukraine. Soros, the single largest donor to the Democrat Party, and partner of John McCain, and investor in Halliburton, Dick Cheney's company. The breakup of Naftogaz, like they want to break up Gazprom, is the centerpiece of Ukraine's reform plans. George Soros in 2015. Chevron signed a $10 billion deal with Naftogaz right before the coup, November 2013. just 1 month after, just 1 month before, Victoria Nuland gave the coup speech with U.S. aid funding in front of a Chevron sign. Let's keep going. I give my all to you guys. We've been streaming 5.5 hours. Gazprom's South Stream pipeline was succeeded in sidelining U.S. corporate interests tied to the corridor. So once again, Gazprom kept outcompeting U.S. companies. That's why we had to kill it. ConocoPhillips, indirect pressure through Lukoil. Conoco held a 20% stake in Lukoil, Russia's largest private oil firm from 2004-2010, after Yukos was folded into Gazprom. I'm sorry, this is oil, not gas. Sorry. Lukoil was the largest private. So just like Yukos was the largest natural gas company privately, and next to the state-owned one, Gazprom, Lukoil was to Rosneft what Yukos was to Gazprom. As Gazprom's dominance grew, private firms like Lukoil faced marginalization. Conoco had to sell its Lukoil stake. So basically, Phillips Conoco, another Houston oil company, is boxed out of Russia. British Petroleum had a $7 billion joint venture with Russian oligarchs in 2003. Initially profitable, but after Gazprom and Rosneft rose, British Petroleum came under pressure. Russian partners clashed with British Petroleum over international strategy. The Kremlin effectively pushed London's main oil company, that and Shell, out of Russia. You wonder why British statecraft is all about war on Russia? British Petroleum was forced to sell its stake to Rosneft, the Russian oil company, ending its major independent upstream position. And then it was boxed out of the Arctic projects. You know, Siberia is in the Arctic. How about Shell? The other big London oil and gas giant. It was the majority operator of the Russian gas project Sakhalin 2. In 2006, Shell was forced to sell its majority share to Gazprom under duress at a cut rate valuation. So they nationalized it. They did the thing that Iran did in 1953 before the CIA put the Shah in power. We cooed Mossadegh out of power because Mossadegh was nationalizing British Petroleum. That's why we have the political instability in Iran right now. Because Anglo-British Petroleum, the big British oil and gas company, together with its Western partners, had control over all the oil in Iran. But Iran is another, just like Russia. Russia's the biggest. Iran's the second biggest outside the U.S. in terms of oil. Other than Saudi Arabia, but Iran would be larger if it wasn't under sanctions. Larger than Saudi Arabia. So they nationalize it. That's why they hate Putin. Nothing to do with democracy. Nothing to do with democratic norms. Nothing to do with democratic principles or global standards or human rights or whatever the fuck. If Putin had done every single thing he's doing, but had the economic open your butthole that Khodorkovsky had, we would have called him a democratic prince, the prince reformer, the man who saved Russia, a model Democrat. It's about the money, honey. 75 trillion. We were boxed out. So crowded out or coerced Western companies, U.S. and U.K. firms, denied access to critical reserves, forced into disadvantaged partnerships, expropriated under political pressure. Bunch of Soros shit. Open Russia, by the way, the Khodorkovsky vehicle funded by his oil wealth, promote civil society, political education, rule of law, independent media, but it was registered as a charitable foundation. Refounded in 2014 after his release from jail. Russian state media often conflated open Russia with open society. Speak at similar conferences. Open Russia partnered and hosted events with groups supported by U.S. and European donors. The Free Russia Foundation, which is funded by the National Network for Democracy, the CIA. Ned supported Russian activists. Youth engagement. Get young people to go out on the streets and riot. So I said, give me a detailed history of the relationship between Kasparov and Khodorkovsky. Went through 4 phases. From 2000 to 2003. So basically, at that time, Kasparov was not politically active. But Kasparov rises as soon as Khodorkovsky is imprisoned. And you heard Kasparov mention that himself. So Khodorkovsky is imprisoned, and then suddenly a threat to democracy emerges in Russia. A threat to Wall Street and London seizing all of the oil and gas. I'm sorry, a threat to democracy. But as soon as Khodorkovsky goes down, the CIA, Ned, USAID superstar, Garry Kasparov, emerges as the beloved by his people as the shining intellect of all of Russia, the world's greatest chess player. Khodorkovsky launches his political front, big coalition, runs for president, leads street protests. Okay, phase 5, new coordination against the Ukraine war. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Kasparov and Khodorkovsky co-founded the Anti-War Committee of Russia 1 month after the war breaks out. Now, it talks about how they had avoided working together publicly. There's a really interesting section here on how they avoided working together publicly because they didn't want the public perception of it looking like they were working together. I think we'll get to that in a second. Reconnection, Exile. So I said, when did Kasparov first begin speaking out against Putin? When did he first begin organizing street protests? When did he first begin working with U.S. universities or U.S.-based NGOs? Give me a detailed breakdown, 2000 to 2013. So here's a detailed timeline. 2002, he says that Putin's building a vertical power that might destroy Russian democracy. 2003, begins giving lectures in Western Europe and the U.S. as part of broader democracy dialogues. Again, this is while Khodorkovsky is preparing to basically betray Russian interests and sell the country out to foreigners. So in 2003, he goes to Columbia and NYU. Columbia. We're back to Columbia. You're gonna freak your shit when we get deeper into this. And remember that 2003, the same year as Exxon is about to complete its acquisition of Russia. We're about to have Khodorkovsky ascendant and fold the Russian financial crown jewel into the American empire. We're going to come back to the Columbia thing in a second, but let's just keep going with this. U.S. NGO. Now, why did I say? Because at the time I'd been limiting my searches to NGOs. But I knew that primarily one of the big back channels are going to be Harvard, Yale, Columbia. The universities are just super NGOs. That's all they are. That's why they get so much government funding. One sec. So in this search, I focused on the universities. And this is very interesting because he began working with Columbia and NYU through their shadow diplomacy places, as we'll see. Okay, should I give away the punchline because it's 4:30 a.m.? Columbia SIPA. He went to Columbia SIPA, guys. The exact place in Columbia that is the CIA supercenter of Columbia University. Columbia SIPA, which literally currently employs the head of the CIA under Trump 1, Mike Pompeo, which literally currently employs Victoria Nuland, Columbia SIPA, the NED chairman and the undersecretary of political affairs, the number 3 at the State Department. Victoria Nuland, the political affairs branch is the CIA branch of state. 48%, as in the JFK file showed, 48% of all U.S. State Department staff in the political section worldwide at that time were not even working at the State Department. They were listed as being working at the State Department, but they were Central Intelligence Agency under diplomatic cover. And Victoria Nuland ran that for the Biden administration. Where is she now? At Columbia SIPA with Mike Pompeo and Hillary Clinton, the fucking Secretary of State. So you have 2 secretaries of state, Mike Pompeo and Hillary Clinton, plus Victoria Nuland, plus Maria Ressa, the CIA censorship super spook. It's exactly where we went in 2003, 2 years before he left the chess world. The very year as Khodorkovsky was being rolled up, and they need to build up a big opposition movement in order to capture all of Russia's oil and gas. Before he sets up the NGOs, he goes to Columbia SIPA, home of Hillary Clinton, Victoria Nuland, and Mike Pompeo. Today, right now, as we speak. That's who's paying Victoria Nuland, Mike Pompeo, and Hillary Clinton, Columbia SIPA. That's exactly where he goes. Before. 2 years before he leaves the chess world to officially enter democratic politics in Russia. You're going to get to that. Begins meeting with scholars and policy experts at think tanks like the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which was run for 7 years, 2014 to 2021, by Bill Burns, who was plucked straight out of the Carnegie Endowment to run the Central Intelligence Agency. He appears in 2005, the year they launched his political career, at Harvard Kennedy School. That's the School of Governance. That's how we have back channels to control government policy in foreign countries, through the Harvard Kennedy School. That's why Luis Barroso is a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, the head of the Supreme Court in Brazil, in charge of censoring the entire Brazil population to keep Lula in and box out Bolsonaro, who is an economic nationalist. 2006 street protests. Okay, so we've been over this. Columbia SIPA. If you're new here, we'll do this one more time. Columbia SIPA, Hillary Clinton, U.S. Secretary of State, Columbia SIPA, Mike Pompeo, Institute of Global Politics at SIPA, CIA Director and Secretary of State. Columbia SIPA, Victoria Nuland. And fucking, this is where Garry Kasparov goes right before he launches his entire political career in Russia, right when the CIA needs a symbol of democratic resistance who can run for president because he's beloved by his people, because he's a big cultural figure, global figure, pride of Russia, because he's the greatest chess player the world has ever known. plays the key role in the anti-Putin protests in 2011-2012, organizes the March of Millions, speaks at the Council on Foreign Relations and Atlanta Council on Civil Society Collapse. Harvard and Stanford's Hoover Institution. I'm going to hold my tongue on that, but if you know, you know. Okay. So again, this happened before. And again, NYU is where the Brennan Center is. The lawfare super center against Trump at NYU. The Brennan Center. It's where these rule of law, international rule of law programs are done. These sort of CIA back channels to the courts. And Columbia is mostly on the media side. Columbia is who administers the Pulitzer Prize. Remember they gave the Pulitzer Prize to the Washington Post and New York Times over Russiagate? The whole Russiagate network, the CIA back channel through Russiagate runs through Columbia. Columbia was, as we talked about, Columbia is a big part of how the CIA entered the universities in the first place. When we went over this amazing article, Philip Mosley organization, man. This incredible article about how in 1946, the young Central Intelligence Agency, I guess 1948, only had 38 Soviet analysts. So the CIA began funneling money and telling its friends in the private philanthropies like the Carnegie Foundation and the Ford Foundation and Rockefeller Foundation to pump up universities to act as CIA back channels and to act as the long arm of the CIA for investigating and making contacts on the ground with intellectuals and dissidents and influential figures across the Soviet Union. It was Columbia University which merged academia, intelligence, and philanthropy, such that there became no line between government and academic work, according to the friggin' Secretary of State. Columbia was getting CIA subsidies. Philip Mosley, who set up this whole Sovietology network at Columbia, which Columbia SIPA specializes in, held top secret clearances directly with the CIA, as well as the State Department, National Security Council. I think it had 9 or 11 different security clearances. Academic. How you guys, oh man, we didn't even get, there's so much we didn't get to. It's crazy. We actually didn't get to the thing that most directly spurred this, which is another one of these USAID gun running scandals. So this is what actually prompted me to do this stream. Garry Kasparov was just like involved in this crazy, because we're involved in a proxy paramilitary CIA backed rebel like not coup, but like military war with Russia and Africa. Because Russia is providing arms to these different rebel groups and installed governments, and they're battling for the resources in Africa. This is part of what's behind this conflict in places like Sudan and all across the Sahel in Africa. Chess legend busted in South Sudan weapons scheme. We're back to Bono with the USAID and Live Aid and Band Aid, the money going $100 million raised for famine relief, but actually 95 million of it goes to buy guns for CIA-backed rebels in Somalia and Eritrea. Garry Kasparov allegedly helped raise cash to buy weapons for South Sudan. Brought in a Jane Street, Wall Street money. Prosecutors say he used his Human Rights Foundation role to mask what the money was for. The same Human Rights Foundation that we've been talking about here. Let's cover this quickly. Wall Street titan who hired Sam Bankman-Fried defrauded into spending $7 million on AK-47s, grenades for South Sudan coup plot. Robert Granieri, let me zoom this in, the co-founder of trading firm Jane Street, a very powerful group, which once gave jailed crypto titan Sam Bankman-Fried his big break in finance, was allegedly deceived into funding a plot to buy AK-47 Stinger missiles and grenades for a coup in South Sudan. Federal prosecutors in Arizona first charged Harvard fellow. Oh. Harvard? How could you? What are you Harvard academics doing involved in a gun running plot in South Sudan? Conspiring to illegally export arms to South Sudan to overthrow its government. Oh no! Why does this keep happening? Harvard, Garry Kasparov's USAID National Endowment for Democracy Networks, Wall Street investors. Granieri allegedly paid $7 million in two payments after meeting Harvard's guy in February 2024 at a Midtown Manhattan condo. Prosecutors say Ajax lawyers stated that Granieri's financing was vital to the plan. Without his financial support, the conspiracy would not be possible. He claimed that the attorney for the Jane Street founder claimed that he was misled by the Harvard fellow. Remember, Kasparov was at the Harvard Kennedy School. Is that where him and Ajax may have met? He claimed he was misled by Ajax, whom he believed was a human rights activist. Granieri is a longtime supporter of human rights causes. In this case, the person thought Rob was a human rights activist. Thought he was giving $7 million to human rights and ended up buying guns. Oh, that's so crazy. The case also references chess champion Garry Kasparov, though he's not named as a defendant, or accused of any wrongdoing for allegedly connecting Ajax with Granieri. The CIA back channel. Here we are again. Oh, here it is. The Harvard Kennedy School, just like I said. And a World Bank economist before becoming a South Sudanese opposition activist. It's too perfect. Ajax, a child soldier resettled in the U.S., went on to be the CIA's control over government back channel, the Harvard Kennedy School, a global bankster gangster economist. That means these are the people who tell you the best way to turn your economy over to them, unless you want to be overthrown in a CIA coup. Read Confessions of an Economic Hitman for more on what World Bank economists are. Before becoming, just like Garry Kasparov himself, an opposition activist. He and Keach allegedly met with an undercover agent and inspected weapons in a Phoenix warehouse before their arrest. This is the other Harvard guy. Harvard, yeah. Put that on your Harvard application. I was a child soldier in a CIA-backed rebel faction in South Sudan. DOJ handout that shows the weapons that were bought via Garry Kasparov arranging deals. Defense attorneys allege U.S. authorities were aware of the plan, citing a public authority defense and claiming that the State Department told Ajax in October 23 it would not support non-democratic regime change. Oh my God. So the State Department said, listen, we're not backing this coup. This is just like the case where the State Department had, what the hell is it? Rolando Masfer. Remember the stream we did on Rolando Masfer? When the CIA intervened on the Justice Department's prosecution of Rolando Masfer, the State Department want him arrested. The CIA want him set free. Didn't want him prosecuted because the CIA said if you prosecute this case, it's going to reveal our entire CIA network in Miami. So the DOJ split the baby. They proceeded with prosecution. but had the government prosecutors protect all the intelligence assets and not allow any lines of questioning that might expose the CIA, that Rolando Masfer was a CIA asset. And the State Department wanted prosecuted because the State Department told Masfer and his CIA-backed Cuban exile squad that the State Department did not want to support the CIA-backed rebels' assault on Haiti, taking over Haiti as a way to take over Cuba. It's the same thing right here in 2023. And just broke, I guess, this week on Kasparov's involvement. They accused prosecutors of selectively targeting Ajax and Keach, both black men, while sparing Granieri and Kasparov, the CIA money funnel and the CIA deal maker. Arranged at the law firm Paul Hastings, of course, so they can get attorney-client privilege and shield everything. PR guru Michael Holtzman, who previously advised the State Department. So they ran this as a CIA operation rather than a State Department operation. That's what this was. The donors and drafters in charge of personnel at CIA wanted to overthrow the South Sudanese government. The donors and drafters who installed the personnel at state did not want a coup or to back a coup publicly. So CIA just ran it through the Garry Kasparov back channel. South Sudan is the world's youngest country after seceding from Sudan in 2011. George Clooney. Biden didn't remember what I look like. Exchange rate is $20 billion in trading revenue. Granieri backs Nikki Haley. Also supported causes backed by Kasparov. Let's dig into this more next time. I have so much already. So many lights are just popping off in my head on this. We're going to get into the geopolitics of Sudan because it relates to Ghana and the other stream we did on Zoran Mamdani and all that. Ooh, it's going to be good. Next stream's going to be a barn burner. But we have been going for 6 hours, guys, tonight. It was lovely being on stream. Good night. Godspeed. I will see you on the internet.